Welcome to A CoFi With, the FinTech Pod. We'll explore the latest trends, innovations, and ideas shaping the financial industry. Join host Alex Irigoyen as he interviews leading experts in the field. Learn from top CFO, tech leaders, investors, and many more. Join us and get inspired. Let's get started.
Hi everybody, and welcome to a new episode of A Coffee With. Today with us we have Jason Berwanger. Thank you very much, Jason, for joining us today in the pod.
No problem. Alex, great to see you again. Coffee with a coffee. So it's a good morning.
Exciting. How it's been the week so far for you?
You know, it's been a good week. It's the theme of 2023 is there's a lot of novel events, and I think old tactics are not working, and it's a lot of like rapid iteration and finding what works, because you know, traditional channels, like even things like SEM and Google and, you know, how to advertise and grow, those things are, they don't behave like they used to with ChatGPT, and, you know, the eyeballs aren't where they used to be. So I think, you know, it's been a lot of creative thinking in 2023, and this week has been no different.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. We'll jump later to ChatGPT. I really want to have your insight about it. But first, if you want, could you share some context about your career, who you are, what you do? I think it's very interesting profile, right? Technology and finance merged together in the different jobs that you've been working. So I don't know if you could share with us from the beginning, let's say from when you start studying all the way to today at LeapFin.
Yeah, certainly. So I have been in like tech, data, and finance for about 15 years. I've worked for a number of B2C, B2B companies. My first initial opportunity was with a small startup in Columbus, Ohio, and it was basically around big data and healthcare logistics. And it really got a chance for me to see that finance was really fun, because that's always what I wanted to do. But underneath finance, there's just a huge data problem. And to get access to the data, you need some technology chops and really understand how to wield that data. And so, you know, that's kind of the thing that hooked me into this career path that I've been on. Since then, I've held a number of roles. I've been an accountant. I've been a finance manager. You know, I've been in a number of both, you know, a 75-year-old company and more of a B2B. It is also like startups that are just a few years old. So seen some things, seen a lot of various problems, both, you know, scale and, you know, high growth, but also mature companies and trying to optimize profit. And then, yeah, I also have had, you know, especially recently in the last 5 years, I pivoted over to really grow that technical expertise. So I've been kind of a director of engineering. I founded financial systems and data. And I've also held a number of like finance and data and accounting type of executive roles. Again, both from a startup perspective and from a more mature company perspective with, you know, hundreds of millions of annual revenue. So it's addicting. I have to pull myself away at night because I love solving these problems. And I believe it's actually the perfect synergy, especially with, you know, these war times and these uncertain times that we're in. You really need to have technical and data and finance chops to be able to make the impact organization that the folks need.
So how do you keep learning? Because it's normally people start in one area, right? And they do all their career in there. Is it through the traditional ways, or how do you keep the pace of both technology and finance?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I have kind of switched back and forth between, you know, business roles and tech roles, and had a number of, you know, switched from a director of engineering to a VP of finance and nothing in between. And the challenge, which is really trying to overcome expectations of the folks you're interviewing with. And it can be looked at in a non-traditional resume to say, this isn't really a great fit for this guy. But I think so. But once you get past that initial resume review and you get a conversation, I think folks realize, no, it's a polyglot, right? When you can speak data and tech and finance, it actually helps the organization to make change quickly and add a lot of value. But even most recently with this role with LeapFin, I'm the chief architect there. mean, the role is, completely cross-functional. One day I could be working with our product team on the product roadmap. We may talk architecture from an engineering perspective, but then later that day, we're working with clients and CFOs and talking with them about their business problems and how to use technology and data to solve them. So I look for those roles where it's not so within a vertical that's defined, but in a way that you can kind of synthesize these operational, these financial, these data, these technology, skill sets, problems, and then you can turn them into value for the organization.
Yeah. So what is exactly, if someone will need to understand from zero, a chief architect? Is it a position close to product? Is it something that we only see in tech firms? I don't know if you could share some context about the specific role.
Yeah, certainly. So the way I would think about a chief architect, and I'll do the same thing I do internally, which is I don't like to put boundaries on it for a reason.
Yeah.
Because I think to be able to move quickly and have that degree of influence to be successful, it's great to not have boundaries. But I think the example roles that you might see someone that's more of like a founding type of architect level person for a startup that can really come in and both understand the business problem and understand how to think about technical problems that aren't today's problems, but maybe 2 or 3 steps ahead. That's part of kind of the advice that I give at LeapFin. But it's also very much like a chief customer architect in some sense. My job in a big way is to not necessarily care about LeapFin as a platform, but to care about the problems that CFOs, controllers, financial systems folks have, and then to advise them, hey, you have an ERP, you've got billing systems, you've got payment systems. What are you really missing? Does LeapFin kind of help bring it all together and then synthesize that into financial records because your problem is disparate data? Or do you have a big data problem and it's really mostly an internal engineering problem? And so that's part of my role is to help advise, key customers, prospects, and really just be a thought leader and evangelist for some of these problems. That then manifests itself, though, with those data points to be part of our product council and lead the vision for the product at LeapFin. And then that also helps to think about what do these customers care about and how do we think about how folks talk about problems so that way we can rally communities of people. And that's very much a marketing and a community bit. So those are really like the core focuses or components of the chief architect role. So it's both engineering, it's product, it's a bit of marketing, and it's also just a thought leadership consultative approach with clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very definitely. You touch in many things. So for the way marketing, sales, customer success, product tech, right? Pretty much all the pipeline.
Why not? Yeah. I mean, if we're here to solve problems, you might as well get into all of them.
That's awesome. Much appreciate the context, Jason. So if we can understand what does exactly LeapFin do? What is the company aiming to solve?
Sure. So the problem I would describe that we solve, I would say, is the great decentralization. And I would kind of juxtapose 2 things. If you look back, let's say 10 years ago, you had an ERP model where your order and your invoice and your payment and then your GL were all contained in a nice, very defined, very rigid data model, but the accounting happened along with your order to cash process. Mm-hmm. If you fast forward today and contrast that from 10 years ago, with all the innovation that we've had and all the investment in tech and certainly, CoFi is an example of this, there is a tremendous amount of innovation that has happened for operational tools, for finance from an analytics perspective. The problem, though, is that because we went and decentralized all these operational functions, financial accounting and the nature of reporting and classifying operational events, that was kind of left behind, and it was an afterthought. And that operational event innovation left behind a pretty big problem. And so what LeapFin does is much like a data warehouse would, we'll go and extract and load and transform that into explicit financial records. Mm-hmm. If you're a tech company and someone ships you back a product and your engineering calls that something special, ultimately, well, what is that? Well, your revenue gets reversed because you no longer perform the revenue because the fulfillment got undone and you got a return. So there's really 2 transactions in there, right? There's a contract modification on the return, and then there's also the return from an invoicing and a cash perspective. And so we model those as explicit objects, and then we then take and have basically a GL layer, which converts and ledgerizes all those transactions into debits and credits to make and basically digitize your income statement and your balance sheet. And we actually push that into your ERP via our pre-built integrations. So what happens then is that now, if you talk to a finance and accounting person, over 50% of their time, from almost any study I've read, is data processing. They're not adding value with analysis. They're not thinking about optimizing policies or writing different tax policies or being more compliant. They're processing data. So what this enables them to do is have a data processing platform that takes on all of those disparate sources and all that. They still own the business logic. They own the accounting policies, but that data processing is owned by LeapFin. And so we find folks that are that need a rigorous level of financial reporting and auditability really care about this. So, if you're looking for a financing event, if you're looking for an IPO, if you've got debt covenants with your bank, those are usually great reasons why folks start talking to LeapFin, because they no longer can rely on accountants and spreadsheets from disparate sources, because there's a key question that's not being answered. How do I know that I can trust my data? If you're pulling data from 15 places and then putting it into Excel sheets, and then they're getting updated by multiple parties, and then you're loading them at a single point in time in your GL, no one knows how we can trust the data. But if you have that in a platform where you run tests against it, and those tests are then exposed to folks, and that you've completely, you have completeness and accuracy checks, now you know that you can trust the data. And that's one of the biggest value adds that LeapFin adds, where 10 years ago that concept would not have been a problem that folks, I think, needed to solve, because the great decentralization hadn't yet happened. So that's a little bit of the problem, and what LeapFin does to solve it, and then why folks care about that problem relative to their own strategy.
Awesome. So you normally then work with mid-large firms, or what's your ideal customer?
Ideal customer is someone that has multiple payment systems, maybe a billing system. Because again, if someone is in more of a B2B type of business model, and they've got an ERP and they invoice out of the ERP and they take ACH payments, unless they're at a really big transactional scale, there's probably not a ton of problems that we can help them with. But if you have Stripe and Braintree and Shopify and Apple Pay and Google Pay, and you have all these different invoicing types in your billing systems, and you've got data everywhere, that's where LeapFin can really help you, because you don't have an accounting and finance problem. You've got a data problem. And that's kind of what LeapFin seeks to help with.
So I assume e-commerce could be a great use case, maybe.
E-commerce is a huge one. Yeah, most folks in e-commerce just go, show me what the cash is that came in, and I'm going to use that to book my revenue. But we know that revenue is performance, and invoicing is accounts receivable, and cash is cash, and you can't really conflate all three of them. So if an e-commerce company goes to take on debt, or they need to have better financial reporting, LeapFin, we've helped quite a few e-commerce companies with that problem, because hundreds of thousands of credit card transactions that are in disparate systems that aren't thinking about the accounting and finance and reporting. That's what LeapFin helps you think about, and it gives you a tool to do so.
Awesome. Great. Thank you very much for sharing, Jason. This context is very, very helpful. I saw you write about the wartime CFO in different posts of yours. I'm very interested about this concept. I think it's definitely now, right, the time for wartime CFOs. So I don't know if you could share some context about what does exactly that term mean.
Yeah, certainly. So this concept came up, and in a number of interviews and some research that we had done with just what was the experience of CFOs and finance leaders, and how was that different from 2 years plus ago to now. And the contrast is, 2 years ago we were rewarding growth at all costs, and so finance role was make sure that we have capital to fund growth at all costs. And the analytics that we were doing was, you just have to look at growth, and you're getting a multiplier on your growth. So finance was basically the fuel to the growth engine, and product and operations and that part of the business was really leading the charge, and they had developed a ton of data resources and analytics to prove out their growth and figure out how do we grow accounts, customers, and total sales, etc. Now, though, if you look at that, there's been a big change in the VC market from a startup perspective. The stock market itself, we're kind of edging on recession, and we've pulled back on a lot of these multipliers for public companies, and capital in general, because of interest rates, is expensive, and it's no longer easy to reward growth at all costs because you're paying a lot for capital, and the supply of capital is a lot tighter. So what that means is that finance is now taking a strategic role, and they're very much taking that wartime role to say, hey, we now have to think about operating expenses and a path to profitability and contribution margins, and we need to be able to tell the story in a more traditional way that can give someone line of sight to how are we actually going to monetize this business? How are we going to make money? And that wasn't a conversation that I heard a lot from folks, especially more in the high transaction digital space. They wanted to grow, they wanted to get capital, but obviously that all of the constraints have changed, because in growth at all costs world, you don't need a wartime CFO because there's very little constraints, because you can always just go out and get cheap money, and there's always a path to raising money on your money. But that's no longer the case, obviously. And so I think because of that, we have way more constraints, and now you need someone that's more of a wartime to go and help folks be held accountable on the operational side and get visibility into financial data on, are we actually profitable? Is there a path to profitability? Does this business model scale? And I don't mean scale in terms of sales or orders or revenue. I mean scale in terms of, is this going to contribute profit to our bottom line?
Yeah. The key now is, I guess, that balance between growth and profitability, right? That's because you don't either want to miss or business opportunities, right? That might require larger investments. So how do you balance those two? I think it's the important thing to address nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. And even if we put the high growth and startup persona aside, even more mature businesses that happen to take a lot of credit cards, they're feeling the pressure, and they're seeing changes in their demand. So because of this, because there's been this tightening, and we're on this, it feels like the edge of a recession, and this demand is tightening. Everyone is having to tighten, because now, your revenue has dropped 40% from 2 years ago. So even if you aren't looking for a fundraise and looking to grow, just to maintain small growth or status quo is out of the question now. And now you're having to retool and say, well, what are my variable costs to produce this so we can have a path to profitability? Those are hard conversations that CFOs and finance leaders are having, even if they're not in startup land.
Yeah. How about pricing? Do you see a lot of conversation? You're very close to B2C, of course. Do you see any topic or conversation around pricing, like with all these changes?
Yeah, the biggest part of that conversation that we hear about, or I'd say the most consistent conversation I have with folks, is around discounting. Discounts is a big piece, because you're looking at revenue, you're looking at your contra revenue discount. You're like, okay, what? I mean, this seems like we're really discounting a lot, right? Like sometimes those discounts are 30% of your revenue. And when you try to peel back that onion, what you find is there's individual item discounts. There was a sign-up discount in a wallet to apply to your first order. There's bundle discounts. And so now you have ASC 606 and revenue implications to allocate some of that discount. Then you've got customer service that gives out discounts for folks that are maybe unhappy, or to reward them for being retained on their next sign-up. And if you're a CFO and you're looking at a single line item, but you have all these individual business events, customer service owns some, marketing owns some, your product team owns some, trying to retain or trying to convert new customers. That's really, really tough from a pricing perspective to understand, are you actually converting more customers with this incrementally lower pricing because of discounts? Or are you just giving away gross profit where these customers are going to be customers no matter what, and we should consider giving less discounts? So there's a lot of discussion on how to do that, and it almost always manifests itself with, I need a P&L or financial data broken down by product and discount type, but I need it to tie back to my financials because I need to be able to understand what's contributing to positive, gross profit or operating margins and what isn't. And then I want to pull levers like, do I not allow multiple discounts? Do I cap certain discounts? Do I want to have an approval process for customer service for discounts once they exceed? Do I have a budget for customer service? All of those are financial levers that folks want to pull, but if they don't know what actually is happening, they don't know what lever to pull. And so that's the conversation I hear a lot with pricing, and it's like, how much should we discount, and where is that price elasticity data point?
Yeah. It's a hard discussion also in B2B, even though the data points are, I would say, less than in B2C. So I can imagine that in B2C with multiple products, different countries, discounts in pretty much every line of the P&L, that conversation becomes very, very complex, and definitely you need to trust your data to take those decisions.
Yeah, exactly. In B2B, while we hear less about pricing, because usually folks are pretty rigorous on the contract side, what you hear a lot about with B2B is margin erosion or revenue erosion, where you have a bunch of bespoke and different types of contracts that you've signed and different price models to gain all these B2B customers. But are you actually implementing that? How is the servicing model? How is your invoicing model? Are you capturing all the revenue that you should? Those are a lot of the discussions I hear on the B2B side, to understand how they're managing their book of contracts and all their B2B business relationships.
Absolutely. One other topic that I wanted to ask you, Jason, is the data monetization. I saw you discuss about it. What does exactly mean? How do companies approach it? What does it mean?
Yeah, I'll put it into kind of two buckets. I think there's offensive data monetization, and then there's maybe a little bit more of defensive monetization. And I'll touch a bit more on maybe defensive monetization, and because I think it's relative for this audience in particular. But any type of lever that you can pull that will enable a net income increase is part of what I would say is the monetization process. And so, if you're in a high digital transaction space and you're taking lots of credit cards, you may have a ton of disputes and chargebacks. And so with that, you saw a policy change in March, for example, with Stripe. You used to get a dispute, you'd pay $15, but if you won it, there was no dispute fee. You'd get the money back. Now, if you win or lose a dispute, if someone disputes it, it costs you $15 per transaction. If you're in a high transaction digital business, that could be all of your gross margins. So one way to monetize that data is to understand what customers and what products and how and when are chargebacks happening, how am I managing those, and then what can I do about it? Do I want to have a bigger deposit up front? Do I want to change the pricing model for certain customers that are more likely to dispute? All of those things would manifest themselves with a monetary gain in net income, less revenue leakage, better operating margins, etc. Because one thing that gets lost in the shuffle from my financial statement perspective is everyone thinks about revenue and cost of revenue and contra revenue and everything that's really above the line. But bad debt and basically revenue that you've performed but not been paid, that's an operating expense. That's part of, I would call the one of the downsides of FASB and GAAP accounting is you have revenue that you've performed but haven't been paid. Well, why isn't that tied back to your revenue somewhere? Well, it's in an operating expense bucket. But a lot of times you're talking a 0.5% to 2% net income in terms of your operating expense eating up your revenue. And so that's one example of how you can kind of monetize that data defensively. Offensively, what's interesting about this, it actually just came up with Leapfin this week. We were talking about data that we needed because we were really having great conversations with certain ideal customer profiles, and we wanted to find who all is out here that meets that criteria. But if you look at the typical data, data as a service and that CRM, being able to pipe in CRM data, we couldn't find the answer to some of these questions. And I had worked with someone who was more in like the data VC space, and they were sharing like, hey, how much have folks fundraised, and we've got a profile of these hundreds of thousands of customers in the United States. I'm like, hey, I don't have that problem. I'm not interested in who fundraised what, but could you tell me this data point about customers and businesses, and give me their domains and maybe number of employees? And they're like, absolutely, that's a use case that we hear often. And so what that told me is like, if you have novel data that kind of tells a story about your customers, and not necessarily selling them, the customer data, in other words, but you can monetize those patterns and sharing that back. And one way I think that you can pressure test this, which I've done at a business before, is you can start to anonymize your data, but share that out in the content you create. And say, here's basically the trend that we're seeing for the businesses that we serve, for e-commerce and for subscription and whatever your key customers are. And if you get a lot of folks going, oh my gosh, this is great data, and you get great feedback, you may be collecting data that's valuable to other folks and be able to turn that into a revenue stream over time. And that's especially true for startup space, because when you deal with novel problems and you're therefore collecting novel data, that's always a consideration to look at. And then the last bit that I'll mention is there's also data that you have from a customer perspective that they may not know about. And so this is a key initiative that I'm taking on at Leapfin, where because we have all this financial data and we've collected it from these operational systems, we're solving the problem they've asked us to solve. But then, can we find novel ways to look at data from one customer and then share the way in which to look at data to create value with another customer?
Yeah.
And that's, and not even from a consulting revenue perspective, but just in terms of how else can you use Leapfin or use your data to find those pockets of profitability, but more on us to them, helping us think about how we're adding value to the customer, not necessarily them playing defense. So I think that's part of the creativity that we're hearing from folks is there's, I'm sure, CoFi is no different. You guys probably have some really awesome data on, key metrics and, how many data sources folks are using by industry. And I think if you found the right niche, there's a lot of value in both how your customers look at that, how you look at that from your customer's perspective, and what the world would look at from the novel data that you're collecting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in our case, crossing the data from the different sources, that's where we get a lot of the best insights. So definitely key in there. Before finishing, Jason, of course, I have to ask you what are your thoughts on AI and the office of the CFO. How do you see it's been a crazy year with ChatGPT, of course, and how do you see it's going to change in the finance team, right?
So they had ChatGPT take the CPA exam, and it did not pass. So
No,
at least for right now, I don't go to ChatGPT from an accounting policy perspective. But I think folks are seeing like ways to harness, especially that like market level data, because when you think about ChatGPT, right, it was trained on all of this data from the internet and pulling in all of these opinions from the internet and then synthesizing that. And so they're great for figuring out like almost like market research type of questions. Like if you want to know how someone thinks about something and it's been trained on thousands of people and how they think about it and how they wrote things on the internet, it's a great way to get that information. Now, in terms of like how to think about business models and profitability and fundraising, like I don't see it right now telling someone who's an experienced finance professional things that they probably don't already know at the specificity they would need. And without some of those accounting chops, it's you can't yet use it for a repository to pressure test your accounting policies or how to think about those bits. So great data points from almost like a market research perspective, and testing how to think about things and how other folks think about things. But I don't think yet useful outside of data processing automation. I don't think it's quite there to be your assistant CFO, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. So one question. Let's assume we have a company, a firm that it has 10 different roles within the finance accounting team, right? Some accountants, some controllers, finance director, CFO, maybe. 5 years from now, same organization, same size, how many people do you think the finance team has? Is it same, more or less?
My take on it is I think it's going to remain flat, and there's a very good reason. I think you're going to see a ton more data sprawl, and data is going to grow exponentially. And so with that, we're going to create a lot more novel problems. But the problems of today are going to go away because of AI or LeapFin or CoFi, because we're solving those problems that we know about today. But those new problems are going to need people to think about them, and they're going to need different tools, and you're going to need folks to keep up with businesses that are really growing, exponentially, and therefore their systems and their data are sprawling exponentially. So I think because of the nature of finance and accounting, you're not going to see a tremendous growth, but I think you will see tremendous growth in the problems. It's just that a person's going to be able to solve a lot more problems by themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, love the answer. We'll review it, Jason, in 5 years to see where we are, if we're still here. Awesome. Last question that I would like to ask you for a young person starting their early career in finance or maybe even in technology. What would you be the things that they should be focused on learning?
Yeah, my advice is to ignore existing structures and to really focus on the tools that you need to add value in an organization, and learn to be a polyglot, right? Don't just know finance, understand the operational levers of the business. Don't just know operations, understand the data and how it translates back into meaningful financial information. Understand technology and really be willing to learn at any point and grow at any point. And I think we do ourselves a disservice with titles and descriptions, and you need accountability. But I think folks really thrive when they can rally on, this is why what I'm doing is important for the organization. Now let me go seek to have the tools in the toolbox to try to solve those problems. And I think if we allow ourselves to be overly constrained there, then we can't take advantage of a lot of this emerging tech and novel ways to solve problems. And I think that's really important in the shift that we're in right now.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I absolutely agree. Jason, it's been a pleasure having you today on the pod. Thank you very much for joining, and I'm looking forward to keep this conversation going with you.
Love it. Alex, thank you so much for having me, and it's great to see you again.
Have a great day. Bye-bye, Jason.